Welcome to the Netflix era!
A $5 billion deal to stream wrestling on Netflix kicked off this week with 4 matches sprinkled across 3 hours of elegant pageantry. The second match featured women wrestlers, and the first, 2 Samoans, one good and one bad. But the headlines were stolen by none other than Hulk Hogan, with the fans booing loudly instead of cheering him as they did at 2024 Trump rallies. The Hulk failed to escape his beer t-shirt. We'll discuss why this and other tableaus appeared to fall flat, as well as the WWE's fragile and fraught transition into the Netflix era. Wrestling's preeminent scholar, Dr. Sharon Mazer, joins us from New Zealand, along with wrestling fan and media critic Sarah Kerchuk, who joins us from Toronto.
That was like my first Raw in probably 2 decades.
I watched most of it. I was thinking how not Raw it was, because I remember watching the early ones in New York City and then 1993, 94, and that was Raw.
Yeah.
That was actually Raw. You know, it was a small venue. It was fast and furious, and there was not a lot of mucking about in the middle, and this was mostly mucking about in the middle. How many matches? 4 matches, yeah?
Yeah.
That the Samoans took an hour.
Yes.
Which
Well,
was
it took half an hour to get them wrestling.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And then the women's match.
Yeah.
And then we had Uso versus McIntyre.
That's right.
And
I've already forgotten.
But it's funny that there were only 4 matches, because I saw 3 of them just by jumping back and forth. It's amazing because I did watch the Netflix boxing match with Mike Tyson, and there was, an endless amount of waiting, which there always is in a boxing match. But I don't know why they wanted to replicate the endless waiting in professional wrestling, because you really don't need to.
Well, the waiting used to serve a purpose, right? So you get the anticipation was the point. So you'd get this long build up but first it's sort of like the power team used to do it. In the minute, we're going to break the handcuffs for Jesus, but first, let us get some money off you or whatever.
Oh, speaking of money off you, did you see Hulk Hogan's appearance?
Yeah, there were 2 things that were really extraordinary about this. One was the opening sequence, which rewrote history completely and was amazingly packaged. Then the Hulk Hogan thing, selling beer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he still can't get the bloody shirt off. He had to walk off like a toddler with the shirt around his ankles. So I felt like, how am I going to be an academic when I'm too busy musing on why he can't get the shirt off his ankles?
There's also the background to it that there's, I think, a photo on Instagram floating around of him arriving on a plane in a MAGA shirt to sell his beer that he actually launched in response to the transphobic hissy fit against Budweiser or Bud Light or whatever it was.
Oh.
There were a number of layers of, just fashy bullshit floating around in the background.
Was the audience booing? I couldn't fully tell.
They were fully
that
booing.
was full
and
booing,
thumbs down throughout the crowd.
Yeah. I couldn't quite. I was sort of in and out of consciousness by this point. I know I have no excuse because it's evening where you are and still a beautiful sunny afternoon here, but I thought it has to be booing. There he is again with the double shirts, because obviously he doesn't show us his chest anymore. I mean, the whole thing was just, and he couldn't really move either.
Yeah.
That was as far as he could walk.
I'll tell you, because I had headphones on, they booed him from the very beginning.
Well, let me tell you something, brother. But you, the fans, have been my greatest tag team partner, because you guys have stuck with me through thick and thin, dudes. I've got a new tag team partner right now. I got Hulk Hogan's Real American Beer that I've teamed up. And in the past, I've had But the greatest partner that the WWE has ever had is the fact tonight we're making history, and the WWE is tag teamed up with Netflix, the greatest tag team partner of all time. So what's you gonna do when the WWE and Netflix runs wild on you, maniacs?
The commentators didn't say a word about him being booed. I think they were surprised. That tells me it wasn't in the script, it wasn't planned, but the audience completely rejected him from the start. And then he tries to hawk some beer, which, thank you for explaining, Sarah, where that all comes from. But what do you suppose that in Los Angeles there just aren't enough MAGA people to drown out the booze, and the majority of people knew he'd spoken at the Republican National Convention and that he was, he had been caught on tape saying the N-word and all of that?
I don't think that was anticipated. It didn't. He seemed entirely ill at ease
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
in that.
And
And
I
I
know
just kept
the
wondering,
WWE have signed a deal to work with his beer company. So they were trotting him out there thinking they were getting a quick plug for it. There's absolutely no hint that they thought it would backfire.
everything that's been wrong with the performances he's given at the Republican convention, at the rally at Madison Square Garden, and now this, everything that's wrong is crystallized. And maybe that's what's most interesting about the whole spectacle, is that when you take out that overblown characterization, shut up, you audience members who hate me because I represent all that is bad in the world, whether it's the IRS or an Arab sultan. Shut up, you audience is the first go-to. That's none of that is there.
Sarah, why do you think they were booing Hulk Hogan?
I think it's an audience who wants to do and believe the right thing while still enjoying wrestling. So I
Yeah.
think they legitimately did not approve of anything Hogan's doing. And he is the most obvious offender in that sphere right now. So they can take a stand by booing him and maybe stay a little ambiguous and less informed about some of the rest of the stuff that's happening.
Yeah, my first impression was, oh, okay, they're just sick of it because there's just been so much Hulk Hogan through the years, and then it's yellow and red. It looks exactly the same. And the other stuff that I saw felt a lot fresher. I thought Roman Reigns really, this is the first time I saw him wrestle. I know he must be a superstar and everything, but that was the first time I saw him wrestle, and I thought he really, he really
He
had
was
a lot of
beautiful.
presence. Yeah. If he didn't have a beer contract, if he had a wrestling contract, then he would have done exactly what you said, Sharon. He would have said, "Oh, you dare boo the man who made all this possible? You dare boo?" But he wouldn't, because he's not going to wrestle again. He's not going to do anything except sell beer. And then the announcer guy who is pretending to be some sort of journalist, which is always Vince McMahon was the only one who convinced me, maybe because I was 9 years old. But all of these people who pretend to be journalists just kind of, I don't know. But he goes, "Well, I'm certainly going to be buying some of that beer," as if none of that had just happened.
I think it was ill-conceived. I mean, these guys, obviously, this is a huge, I just think the money involved in this production
Yeah.
must have been extraordinary, right? And that each of those older stars would have been paid a huge amount of money for this particular show, that it may not carry on as Raw carries on, but for this first premiere on Netflix, where the Netflix T-shirts and various, the plugs for Netflix were going a mile a minute. So if Hulk Hogan had ripped the shirt and it had said Netflix, it would have been in keeping with the evening. And
Didn't it? Didn't it
uh,
say Netflix?
but I'm sure it said American beer on the front or
Well,
something.
he came out with beer, and then he ripped his shirt, and it said Netflix. I think that's what it was.
Hulk Hogan was always, I mean, he loved his audience. I remember being at Madison Square Garden, watching him work the crowd after the match. They'd be picking up the chairs, and he'd still be posing for the
Mm,
last 10-year-old, you know? He
Hmm.
was really good that way. That was a good thing as well as an ego thing because he really went out there for his audience in that way. I never heard a wrestler say a good thing about him. They were, he's not a good wrestler. He works, at best, he works stiff, and you're not necessarily safe in the ring with him. And he wouldn't be able to finish if everybody didn't help him get there. And all of this gossip about him back in the day. Nobody really liked him, but he got the push from McMahon, and he was, for a while, that really shining light. He was the American ideal, sort of flowing on from the Reagan years into the first Bush years, and then sort of fading out when Clinton came in. So very much aligned with that um, sort of Republican boosterism. So I don't think people much liked him, and every time he surfaces, that ambivalence comes out. And certainly the smart fans were horrible about him, even back in the day. The smarter the fan, the less likely the fan was to say, have a nice thing to say. Whereas Macho Man could be either a face or a heel, but everybody knew he came from a wrestling family. He was a really good technical wrestler, and if he chose to do the heel thing of breaking all the rules and being klutzy about this or off about that, it was part of the craft from the fans' perspective, as well as the other wrestlers. And you don't get any of that respect ever for Hogan. So maybe, I mean, it'd be interesting to know what the demographic of the audience actually, beyond those rows of stars, what the demographic, and who knows what incentives they were given,
Mhm.
um, the demographic of the audience itself. Has it shifted from the because the audience seems to have gone through various demographic shifts over the generations. Are these still young guys? Is it heterogeneous in the way that it was when I was watching in the late 80s, early 90s, or was it more men as it became in the 90s and early 2000s, where it sort of became that a young man's game? Has it shifted again? Because when that first wave of really good women wrestlers came in, there was a lot you could pay attention again because
Mhm.
they were really good at flying. They were really athletic in a way that the men were not. I mean, the women were beautiful for a while.
Oh, yeah.
This wasn't that, but there was a period where the women were really skilled. So the question of which audience booed, who was that audience that did boo? Um,
I do think the demographic has shifted a little bit from the peak sausage party incel
mm,
male years. And
mm,
not just because the women were treated, as more as athletes, which made some people feel comfortable. John Cena was huge for bringing in families and children. Roman Reigns has been big, not just for children, but for women, to the point where
mm.
some of the old demographic hated him because he thought that he was only for girls, and it was used not as a point that like, look at this guy who's drawing in an new audience. It's like, look at this guy who doesn't matter because he's appealing to the wrong audience, not the real wrestling fans.
Hmm.
Oh, interesting.
Um,
Yeah.
I believe we've grown past that a little bit. The new sort of generation or the women fans who have come back have just refused to go anywhere and refused to take shit about it and have become an established part of the demo. It's also easier when, that Eric Bischoff in character isn't like getting lesbian slammed by 2 minute warning or whatever. You can like watch it a little more comfortably than those eras.
I'm going to offer something that I think is probably heresy here, but do we miss Vince McMahon? I mean, seriously, I mean, Triple H is really smart about what he's doing. They know what they're doing, the people who are doing this promotion, but do we miss because the New Day thing was supposed to be funny and it was so not funny. And that was so not funny that they did it more than once. Even the scenes of the wrestlers ringside having a good time didn't sell in the way that you would expect. The Hulk Hogan was entirely misjudged, one way or the other. It was entirely misjudged. The Undertaker on a motorcycle is probably one of the stupidest. It's almost as stupid as Hulk Hogan in that light. The balance of wrestling and wrestler performance to the other things seemed ill-judged as well. So how much of this
Hmm.
makes us miss the craft of the former, abusive and violent and all the other things gang that Vince and his cohorts, while producing, how much of that nastiness actually was intrinsic to the spectacle that was so enticing in the first place?
I mean, it's entirely possible. I love a lot of films made by absolutely horrible people. I wonder though, like, I think toward the end, Vince McMahon wasn't Vince McMahon anyway.
No,
So
it's true.
maybe it's less that we needed a monster and just someone who's so self-absorbed to allow themselves to be creative in a way that's not self-conscious at all, which can often lead to monstrosity. Something I noticed about the show today, which I'm assuming was done to bring in older fans to make them care again, or at least bring in the household names that they don't necessarily have in the modern day, is that there wasn't a lot of new generation to push there. It was all just
No.
like, hey, remember when we had this guy? Oh, hey, remember this guy? Didn't you like him? Like even the women's match, which
Yeah.
I mean, there is a tangential connection to Eddie Guerrero there, but it was just also done because people love Eddie. So let's reference Eddie again.
And you say that, New Japan, these other promotions don't need to be evil in order to produce a really good show.
I
So
mean, that we
maybe
know of, but also the language
those
barrier
cultures,
certainly,
yeah.
and the culture insulates us from what may or may not be happening behind the scenes too. So it might not be evil, but it might just afford us a level of plausible deniability that we can go with.
Oh, that's true. But it may be the corporatization of the event itself, because it is also highly, highly corporatized. What hoops might they have had to jump through in
Mhm.
order to get the sign up from the executives on the Netflix side, for example? What does their new board look like, and how does it see its risks and the need to mitigate them? The sexism is still there, the racism is still there, the whole exoticization of Samoa. I lost track of what I actually know of the culture versus what they were telling me. I got lost almost immediately, and what a strange way to start. It might work in Los Angeles because it has an enormous Polynesian set of communities, really. But the deal is for the filmed audience, not the live audience.
I actually remember Afa and Sika, the wild Samoans, very vividly. And I was thinking about this even before the first hour of the show was about us. Basically, it was the Lion King, right? Someone within the family is trying to usurp the king. Um, but it's still better, in my opinion, than what Vince McMahon was doing in the 80s because Afa and Sika would come in with their hair all, afroed out. They'd have these big eyes, and Lou Albano would always speak for them. They never spoke for themselves, and if they did, they would use their native tongue to scare the shit out of us. That was the whole point, to make them so foreign and so animalistic, so like pulled out of the jungle on a leash by this white manager that you're like, oh my God, who knows what these guys will do? They terrified me. And then you fast forward all these years, and because of The Rock, my kids are all about Moana. And if you hear the Samoan language in Moana, it is so beautiful. So something beautiful came out of wrestling, I can say that. And then here they are, they tried their best. It was a little bit trying too hard. But what they were saying was, look, the Samoans can be good guys and bad guys now. So we're not like we used to be. We've got this whole Lion King story. There's a good Samoan, there's a bad Samoan, and here comes some more good Samoans. Here comes some more bad Samoans. And what it was in the '80s was Hulk Hogan would have to run in and rescue Bob Backlund from too many wild Samoans ganging up on him.
And I will
It's true
say
that
this angle has been going on like for at least a year now, if not longer. This is like the story that overshadows all of WWE is the bloodline. And it hasn't
okay.
always been so exotified. I wonder if they were really, really putting it on to show off their diversity for Netflix tonight.
Yeah.
But in general, they've all been fully fledged characters. With nuance and agency. So there have been moments where it actually has been a great step forward. And I think everyone who's been involved in that storyline has been respected by like writers, producers, and fans alike.
It's not Umaga
No.
by any
Yeah.
stretch. I mean, professional wrestling at its most interesting has always pulled up whatever, vibe is circulating anyhow, whatever's in the air. And so I'm wondering if, as critical as we're being of what we saw from our sort of smart fan-ish kind of perspectives, and Sarah, I think you win the prize because you actually know what you're looking at, and I am so far out of it. And maybe because of that sort of flatness and that kind of narrowing of the band of performance itself, I'm wondering if if we step back and if we look again, and if I put on my academic hat more firmly, if what we are actually seeing still can be used as a diagnostic for something to do with the state of the states at this point,
Mhm.
in terms of where these various political lines, social lines are going. So yes, there's more authenticity. And it's true, they were at least real people-ish in that first match in a way. And no matter how many came out, there was still a sense of real people-ish. And it was beautiful when the two leapt out of the ring and slammed the two out at the same time. I thought, yes, that's what it used to be.
Yeah.
That was beautiful. So there was a sense of the skill and the commitment both to who they were and what they were fighting for, but also in terms of playing it out using wrestling as a language, and it was easily the longest match in that sense, but it was also the most convincing as wrestling. But then that emphasis on the tribal, the emphasis on the nativeness of it, and the kind of mysticism, the holding up
Oh
of
yeah.
the object and sort of praying over it, this weird mysticism of the native thing going on. We hit the same marks. They're just a little flatter, but nonetheless more true to the current sort of zeitgeist.
You think that part of the reason it might feel flatter to us now is that when we were all engaged, wrestling was still somewhat outside of mainstream culture, reacting to culture. And now that it's shaped so much of the culture, it just becomes this sort of weird muddy.
Yeah, the attraction of wrestling was always that one didn't talk about wrestling. That I would go into the staff club at the University of Canterbury and the old guys there, because it was predominantly male when I started at Canterbury 30 years ago. I'd go into the staff club, which was all men, and they go, ah, you do wrestling, you talk about wrestling, you're not a serious academic. And then they'd wander off, and then 5 minutes later they'd find me in a corner and go, but do you think?
Hmm.
Because they were actually closet watchers. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. It was sort of down a dark street and
Hmm.
off to the side, and something you didn't talk about in polite company. Everybody had seen, but nobody would admit to, kind of thing. Whereas now, Netflix, it's not just got sponsors to appeal to, it's got boards to appeal to on several sides. It's got to be the product. It's always selling.
Mhm.
I had a thought when I was watching it that the problem was it's such a love fest. There's just no room for a good heel, and that's why it's falling flat. We keep bringing out all the old stars, so there just wasn't room for the drama that a heel can really bring. But now that you mention about the boardroom. I directed a number of films in Hollywood, actually in LA, I should say, because they were indie films. And I always noticed that once a director was making a movie for a studio, there was really no edge left because the decisions were made by committee. Well, you said maybe, the problem is we don't have Vince McMahon anymore. We just don't have that auteur. He's so many other things that that we've criticized in other episodes, but he was an auteur in this art form, and now there's beer commercial companies. So there's just so many cooks in the kitchen that it ends up being kind of a dog's breakfast.
Or it's so defensive at this point, and maybe it will find its feet again. Don't forget, remembering that this is a re-entry of sorts,
Mhm.
a readjustment, especially after the Mr. McMahon documentary, which Netflix sort of sidelined anyhow, but so that they will be deeply concerned to meet. I can see the imagination of how they're meeting their audience and where their audience is sitting, not trusting that audience is going to be there for, regardless. Wrestling is always at its best when it knows its audience, whether it's, an indie or New Japan or the WWE. It knows its audience. It's almost a defensive crouch, this particular production,
Hmm.
because they've been accused and because the sort of very small residue of the old guard are keenly aware of what's at stake here. And because the investment, even so, Netflix has put so much money into this, and the stakes are actually quite high, and so they can't afford to risk, but in so doing, they forget their audience. And so maybe that Hulk Hogan moment is actually a wake-up call. Be interesting to see how they process that, how they process the flatness of with which some of the bits hit. Because it wasn't much of a live show,
Yeah, there was
regardless.
a lot of engagement there. I guess they
I mean,
just sit and watch the film segments on the Titantron.
yeah, a lot of what the audience saw was also on the screen rather than on the stage, which is not uncommon these days. And avant-garde theater's been doing it for generations as well. But it did feel storyboarded at a lot, it did feel the cameras felt plotted, and they didn't have to be. We've seen lots of examples in dramatic television series where the cameras seem to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time, where the actors are essentially improvising. Think of Succession is famous for that at this point, or that episode of The Bear that was in real time where the cameras just followed everyone. So it's not like the cameras can't do that at this point. So they almost feel like they're a generation behind in their understanding of how the technology can meet the event or can manage the event. In wrestling, you don't use, if you're in the live, you see the platform, you see the people around it, you see the other members of the audience, and it's this energy generating experience. If all of a sudden your attention is drawn to the close up here and the backstage there, and then all of a sudden the visceral experience, the kinesthetic experience is shifting in such a way that we're not getting that liveness. So maybe when we're nostalgic, it's also because our attention was there, because the performers were more aware of our attention and more playing for one screen instead of five. And all of that has just shifted, if not diminished, the experience.
I went to a few Raw and SmackDown tapings in Toronto in probably around 2002, 2003. And I would say by then it was just a common part of the experience that we all kind of, I mean, we were into it, but it did feel more like a TV taping. In three, two, one, everybody cheer, that kind of thing, which I
Mm,
maybe the faithful WWE audience has been conditioned to do over multiple
yeah.
decades now, and has just accepted that's part of their role as opposed to just a more traditional live sporting audience experience.
I was pleased that Sarah watched that first episode that you did with us, Sharon, and I
Mm,
wondered if she had a response. And I'll just set it up this way. You told me while we were recording that episode that you were really struggling to reframe how you feel about wrestling because it has had such an impact on American society that it essentially paved the way for Trumpism.
mm,
And
mm.
Sarah, I wonder if you picked up on that and if you had a response.
Well, it made me realize that probably part of the reason I do feel comfortable getting back into wrestling so much is because I love wrestling that has absolutely no influence on culture. So I'm like insulated from a lot of that
Mm.
reckoning or even just that experience because, you know, like one of my favorite wrestlers wrestling a blow up doll is going to go viral, but it's not going to have any influence politically ever, hopefully. Um, I'm giving the world too much credit there. Um, that discussion brought into stark relief to me that it is a reckoning that I think any fan needs to take if you're still participating in the mainstream culture of pro wrestling right now. I mean, I think most of us who are like paying attention to more than just like, ooh, that sucks this week, have figured out that all of the building blocks were there. I mean,
Mm.
just ideologically in terms of the approach of, kayfabe, also how like reality television took up that line when everyone knew wrestling was fake because people still wanted that level of delusion to believe that what they were watching was real, even though they wanted a crafted story. Um, yeah, it all has snowballed into a culture where
It may be we're to a point in the way audiences consume, uh, uh, especially filmed material, but any kind of performance at all, whether live or not. It may be that the audiences have been so tuned that it no longer matters to some degree. We can have the WWE premiering its new Netflix series on the day that on January 6th, on the
Hmm.
anniversary of the riots, on the day that Kamala Harris got up and did her job without interference, the normalization of the January 6th riots, the way in which the anniversary is being remarked upon. And here we have, I couldn't get over it. I mean, I did settle down, but I couldn't get over again that introductory passage which said, real and wrestling, they're all the same now. And that is happening at the same time that we're marking this anniversary. It's just somehow mind-boggling. It's just bewildering to some degree. And it tells you where we've come, this kind of, pay no attention to the former chairman of the board who may go to prison, whose name won't be spoken except indirectly 3/4 of the way through when we introduce his daughter to you. This kind of shifting of the veil, the normalizing of the whole thing does still reflect what's going on. It just does it in a different way, or we have to work differently to understand it. And the audience in the arena, the ones who were booing Hulk Hogan, probably just hadn't got the memo in quite the same way.
Well, I guess what I have to say to the question, do we miss Vince McMahon, is
I'm
that
sorry.
no, I'm glad you brought, I love that. Um, it's that Donald Trump and Fox News and its imitators today are more professional wrestling than professional wrestling. The thing that really struck me in the last few days was the New Year's Eve attack in New Orleans. And as you would do in professional wrestling, you look at current events and you say, "Oh, what could I grab that would really produce the most heat, and I'll sell that as true." And the fans will go along and say, "Yeah, yeah," and they'll scream and they'll yell. And so Fox News says, "Well, we need a Mexico immigrant angle. Oh, the truck was recently in Mexico. Okay, we'll report that." There's probably 30 million people in the United States who think that we were attacked by a Mexican on New Year's Eve,
And
and they don't
illegal.
yeah, they don't realize the guy was born in the United States and was a service member.
Yeah.
And that's what used to make wrestling work so well. It was that you shamelessly would pick the thing that would goad the majority, the dominant culture the most. The Iron Sheik, you know, takes the belt from Bob Backlund. And so Fox News and Donald Trump do that, but this wrestling show really didn't.
Yes. I think the truck attack in New Orleans, what's interesting is you capture your audience in the first 10 minutes. You tell them, and then it doesn't matter what you say or what eventuates because they're already moving on and they've already just internalized that. Um, but this isn't this the show we saw doesn't do that quite either. They haven't got the new thing quite in their hands, and they the old isn't working for them. So it's probably that they're in transition.
Mhm.
As a company, they're probably deeply um, injured at the moment, and they don't have the past to draw on, but they don't have the future either. It's been interesting to watch the old wrestlers it was interesting to watch them debate Donald Trump's candidacy, which I'd never seen before, maybe because I'm not such a social media, but all of a sudden, Twitter is blowing up with all the different wrestlers taking sides for or against Trump. And that's fascinating. And that's probably Hulk Hogan's fault as much as anything. Because
Mhm.
so maybe the reason the audience, the live audience, the ones who'd really invested in being there, booed Hogan is because they had seen Batista, they had seen Jim Cornette, who was so eloquent, and several of the others um, really trash talk Trump, but also Hogan as part of that. Undertaker as well was pro Trump, wasn't he?
Oh
I
yeah.
think so. There were just a couple of wrestlers who were still under contract to WWE. Most of them were current wrestlers who spoke for Trump. And this was going back and forth in the couple of weeks leading up to the election in a way that was really extraordinary because they were so using all the skills, all the um, um, structures that all the dramaturgies, the theatricalities that they would use in challenging each other was
Mhm.
directed towards Trump or in defense of Trump, not so much against Kamala, but in defense, pro-Trump or anti-Trump. These clips, these 2 or 3 minute clips, were just like promos for the WWE, only absolutely political for the first time. People taking a stand that way, wrestlers taking a stand. So it may be the reason the audience, which is sort of the problem we keep coming back to, the reason the audience booed Hogan and the reception for The Undertaker fell flat, aside from the fact that it was on a motorcycle. Um, maybe part of that is that the conditioning was extra to the wrestling world of wrestling entirely was being performed on Twitter in the political arena, and that's still fairly fresh. So that's really interesting because all of a sudden the politics of wrestling have become political, far outside the arena in a way that is still not quite real life, but is closer to the real than we've ever seen before.
Hmm. Maybe it's what Sarah said about her favorite wrestler and the blow up doll. She want you want to know that your make believe world that is kind of giving you, you know, that's entertaining you is not impacting culture. It's not impacting presidential elections. And Hogan just reminded everyone, oh, yeah, it does. It does. The whole Fox News, Donald Trump complex reeks of professional wrestling. And I think people, I think people wish it didn't.
That could be, and maybe they're also misjudging the Netflix audience, which would probably skew more middle class and educated, perhaps, than the cliche, at least, of a Trump voter. But I think you're right, Eric, that the playfulness of that, the setting the way it's set aside just far enough from everyday life
Mhm.
to be a safe space for that. If wrestling gets too into its realist mode, which it seems veering towards again, we're going to lose the play part, which allowed us, even if it was offensive or outrageous or awful or just plain stupid, allowed us to have a good time because we could play too. But if
Mhm.
we're not being invited to play with, and this wasn't a very playful 3.5 hours, 3 hours, it wasn't playful really with us. It didn't play with us very much.
I was curious to see if any part of me would come back to loving it like I did as a child. And I have to say, Sarah, the closest thing all of this, 6 weeks or so that I've been studying wrestling was a thread from your. That was an article about these two Japanese wrestlers and their long-standing, many matches against each other, the respect they have for each other, and that they were doing their last match. And then also in looking at your Twitter feed, there was some interesting imagery, all from the Japanese wrestling league.
I mean, that's almost entirely what I watch
Yeah.
now. When I gave up on wrestling, I thought I was never ever going to watch it again. And there were a number of reasons for that. I mean, obviously the content of what I was watching in the WWE was starting to drain on me. It wasn't just the sexism and the racism and all the big things were going on. But under the undercurrent of that is that in the WWE, especially like the McMahon influenced angles, um, family and friendship and human bonds were always severed for drama, and not in like an interesting way, in a way that always made you feel stupid for investing and caring. And that's what burned me out more than anything.
Yeah.
So when there was an angle in New Japan in 2018 that was about like these wrestlers who had been feuding for years reuniting, and I realized that it wasn't like going to be broken in a really cynical way, that intrigued me enough to start watching again. So that's how I got hooked on the Japanese side. And I think part of why that's working better is simply that because the focus is on the matches and the storytelling in the ring, it's up to the wrestlers themselves to put together whatever story in between it and what continuity they want to bring to it. And some of them are really invested in that to the point where they will, subtweet each other in a way that is part of the story, or blog about each other, or say something backstage that will hint at something they said years ago, or they'll do each other's moves in a way in a match that is a reference to something else. So you can just watch it and be like, yeah, that's a banger, 5 stars or whatever. Or you can get more invested in it and know that there's all these little Easter eggs that are pieced together, for the fans who are paying attention. And I think also for their own creative fulfillment, that it's just like they get to put those things in that don't interfere with the main story. But there's an investment for the fans, and there's a reward for the fans who want to invest in it. And that also, like, people break up, turn on each other, everything in between. But there are bonds that aren't just there to manipulate you and make you feel stupid for caring again in the end. I have made more people who never understood wrestling respect that it actually takes skill and vision by getting them to watch matches with this doll
That
than
makes sense.
anything
Yeah.
else they've ever seen. Than like, Okada versus Omega, or whatever the serious business match of the day is. And yet there's so many wrestling fans who insist that this is making a mockery of wrestling as opposed to being a very playful, earnest celebration of its possibilities that happens to, like, involve the audience in a little playful suspension of disbelief. That's a lot easier to do. Like, I will pretend this doll is real is easier than I will pretend that I don't know that, these 3 members of WWE's developmental team are all kind of QAnon-y these days. It's like, so you can have fun, and it's fun, but it also shows off the skill of wrestling. It shows off the creativity of wrestling. And there's just like so many outspoken wrestling fans who cannot deal with it being anything but the most serious, somber business now. And I think it
Oh
sucks.
dear, that's no fun.
I know.
Because you want to go, he's behind you, or don't get
Ah!
cocky, or how dare you? There was nobody going, how dare you?
Oh, that's true.
Like they
There's
were standing up and going, ah, like that. So even that serious wrestling fans, you'd expect them to be going, oh, like this. And there was none of that. You know, but that's almost wanting it to be real instead of wanting to um, be part of the as if it's real.
Mhm.
And knowing that that's on a continuum, a spectrum of realness rather than this absolute. I mean, the WWE launched its new Raw on Netflix on the same day that we were both confirming the election of Donald Trump as president and praising somehow Kamala Harris for having done her job in an ordinary way, and and commemorating the anniversary of January 6th and talking about how all those men are going to be pardoned now. It's mind blowing at some level. You can't move the room far enough, perhaps. So, what else can we do? Becomes the question. How else can we, if chanting doesn't work necessarily, if marching, if reinforcing things on social media, producing documentaries, podcasts, art, criticism. I mean, academic writing doesn't do anything, so let's leave that alone. What can we do?
Well, one of the things I noticed in the early, heavily scripted part of the show was that they were trying to tell the audience, this is you. The whole world is looking at you. Look what you've done. And it reminded me of the part of your book when you talked about how they would say boring if it wasn't good enough. And then the guys would jump to it. So the audience felt like, oh, yeah, I can influence the story. And some of the best heel turns and some of the best face turns did result from the way the fans were reacting. And Vince McMahon was brilliant enough to take that and use it. And where I think Hulk Hogan just bombed so badly is he came on and he reminded the audience that no, 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 no. We are the ones who manipulate you. You don't influence us.
We
And
own you.
yeah, because we're going to sell you beer.
Roman Reigns is a classic example. Didn't he go from heel to face because the audience just loved him?
Mhm.
I think you're absolutely right, Eric. The audience, well, I don't know. The audience knew what it was supposed to do and it refused to do it. That's a
I,
hopeful thing, perhaps.
exactly. I was responding to you saying that you don't see where there's hope. And I don't think it comes from some media that hits the audience. There has to be already a zeitgeist in the audience, not just the wrestling audience, but the country as a whole, that says, okay, we see your gimmicks, we see your kayfabe, we see your neo kayfabe, we see how it's infected every other kind of media and all of the things that depend on media, like politics, and we're sick of it. We don't want to be manipulated anymore. I think that's what that moment represented.
Maybe there is hope in the fact that everyone booed Hogan, even if it was ignored, even if it was ineffectual. It was visible. It's certainly going to
Hmm.
eat at people within the WWE that it happened. It'll annoy Hogan, which doesn't change the world but makes me happy. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
so you know what? Even if it ends up being a futile gesture, we at least have this one sign that, people who were very happy to cheer that they paid a lot of money to be there, who were happy to be there, aren't just going to buy into every single thing that is lobbed at them.
I think there are very few plots in the world, right? The dramaturgy of everyday life is a fairly limited scope. And so that wrestling is one of the paradigms we can use to explain everyday life shouldn't surprise any of us, given how almost everyone has seen at least one bit of something or seen a wrestler or is a fan of The Rock or John Cena or whatever. It's not a Rosetta Stone for the way the world works, but it is one of the keys that you can use. Yes, Trump is very influenced by wrestling, and he got his time center stage in the center ring at Madison Square Garden, so he's happy about that, I'm sure. But it's the way we respond to it that really seals the deal.
Wrestling Darkness is written, recorded, and edited by yours truly, Eric Byler. The music is composed by Michael Brook, while this jazzy improv rendition you are hearing now was performed by David Benene and Stephen Munoz. Wrestling Darkness and other content you will find on the Eric Byler Substack feed are supported by a 501c3 nonprofit called ID Alliance. You can support us by subscribing or by making a tax-deductible donation. Thanks for listening.